Throughout the entire course of human history, nations have not only formed friendships and alliances, but have also developed some of the deepest, most dangerous, and most enduring enmities the world has ever seen. Rivalries rooted in territorial disputes, religious differences, ideological conflicts, historical wounds, colonial legacies, and raw power struggles that have led to wars, proxy conflicts, economic warfare, nuclear standoffs, and decades of mutual hostility that continue to shape the geopolitical landscape of the world even today in 2025, and among all the bitter rivalries that exist on this planet. 10 stand out as the most intense, most historically significant, and most consequential enemy relationships between nations, beginning with the deeply hostile and decades-long enmity between the United States and Iran, which erupted with full force following the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when the pro-Western Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was overthrown by Ayatollah. Khomeini's Islamic Revolution, fundamentally transforming a country that had once been a close American ally into one of Washington's most determined adversaries, and the hostility became immediate and visceral when Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in November 1979 and held 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 days, an act that shattered diplomatic relations between the two countries and ignited a mutual hatred that has never been extinguished. And in the decades that followed, the United States and Iran engaged in a relentless cycle of confrontation, including the U.S. support for Saddam Hussein during the devastating Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, which killed approximately 1 million people, the U.S. military shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988 that killed 290 civilian passengers, decades of crippling American economic sanctions that have strangled the Iranian economy, Iran's sponsorship of militant groups across the Middle East that have attacked American interests and personnel, and most dramatically, the U.S. assassination of Iran's most powerful military commander, General Qasem Soleimani, in a drone strike at Baghdad airport in January 2020, an act that brought the two countries to the very edge of direct war. And as recently as 2025, a Gallup poll found that 61% of Americans identified Iran as an enemy of the United States, making it one of the most consistently hostile bilateral relationships in the modern world. The second and perhaps most nuclear-charged enmity on this list is the conflict between India and Pakistan, two South Asian neighbors born from the same British colonial partition of 1947, but immediately plunged into war just weeks after their independence over the disputed territory of Kashmir, a conflict that has since produced 4 full-scale wars in 1947, 1965, 1971, and the Kargil War of 1999, plus countless military standoffs, terrorist attacks, and cross-border skirmishes that have killed hundreds of thousands of people over nearly 8 decades. And what makes this rivalry uniquely terrifying is that both India and Pakistan are nuclear-armed states, making their conflict one of the most dangerous on Earth, since even a limited nuclear exchange between the two countries could kill tens of millions of people and trigger a global nuclear winter. And the Kashmir dispute remains unresolved to this day, with both countries claiming the entire region as their own sovereign territory, and the hostility between them was demonstrated most recently in May 2025, when, following a devastating terrorist attack on April 22nd, India launched punitive missile strikes on Pakistani territory on May 7th, triggering a 4-day armed conflict that again brought the two nuclear powers to the brink of catastrophe before a ceasefire was agreed on May 10th, as documented by both the Stimson Center and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the depth of this enmity is reflected in the fact that the two countries have no open land trade routes, no normal diplomatic relations, and populations on both sides that have been raised on generations of mutual suspicion, fear, and hostility. The third most consequential enemy relationship in the world today is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which, while appearing to be a relatively recent confrontation, actually has deep historical roots stretching back centuries, but which erupted into open warfare in February 2014 when Russia first occupied and annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, and then supported separatist forces in the eastern Donbass region, and escalated into one of the most destructive wars in Europe since World War II, when Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, launching a military offensive that he initially expected to conclude in days, but which instead became a grinding, devastating conflict that by the end of 2025 had killed an estimated 275,000 to 325,000 Russian soldiers alone, according to CSIS analysis, along with enormous Ukrainian military and civilian casualties, and as of February 2026, and exactly 4 years after the full-scale invasion began, Russia still occupies approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory. The war continues with no permanent peace settlement in place despite negotiations, and the relationship between the two countries has been permanently poisoned to a degree that will take generations to heal, with Ukraine's entire national identity now defined in large part by resistance against Russian aggression, making this one of the most bitter and bloodiest enemy conflicts of the 21st century. The fourth great enmity featured here is the extraordinarily complex and violent conflict between Israel and Palestine, which has its roots in the late 19th century when the Zionist movement began advocating for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Ottoman-controlled Palestine, and which intensified dramatically after the United Nations proposed a partition plan in 1947 that would divide the land between Jewish and Arab states, a plan accepted by the Jewish leadership but rejected by the Arab states, leading to Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948, immediately followed by a war in which 5 Arab nations invaded the newly born Israeli state. And during this conflict, more than 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes in what Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, creating a refugee crisis and a wound in Palestinian national consciousness that has never healed, and the conflict has continued across more than 7 decades through multiple wars, uprisings, occupations, and peace processes that have all ultimately failed, with the most recent and devastating chapter beginning on October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, killing approximately 200 people, and Israel responded with a military campaign in Gaza that, according to various international agencies, resulted in over 45,000 Palestinian deaths and the destruction of large parts of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, making this one of the most internationally watched, most politically divisive, and most deeply felt conflicts anywhere in the world. The fifth profoundly hostile rivalry is the one between North Korea and South Korea, two halves of a single nation that was divided along the 38th parallel after World War II, when the Soviet Union occupied the North and the United States occupied the South, and whose division was cemented in blood by the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, which began when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, in a massive invasion of South Korea, drawing in both American-led UN forces and Chinese troops in a conflict that ultimately ended not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice in July 1953, meaning that technically North Korea and South Korea are still at war to this day more than 70 years later, separated by the world's most heavily fortified border, the demilitarized zone, and ruled by governments with completely opposite political systems, with South Korea being a thriving liberal democracy and one of the world's most advanced economies, while North Korea is an isolated totalitarian dictatorship under the Kim dynasty that has developed nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, while its people suffer from poverty and human rights abuses, and the enmity between the two countries was dramatically underscored in 2020 when North Korea blew up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, a symbol of past cooperation efforts, and Kim Jong-un officially declared South Korea an enemy state, ending even the pretense of eventual peaceful reunification. The sixth major enmity is the deep-rooted rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is simultaneously a geopolitical power struggle for dominance over the Middle East, a sectarian conflict between Sunni Islam led by Saudi Arabia and Shia Islam championed by Iran, and a proxy war that has been fought across multiple countries including Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Bahrain, leaving hundreds of thousands of people dead and entire societies shattered, and the roots of this rivalry go back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which produced a Shia Islamist government in Tehran that directly threatened the legitimacy of the Saudi monarchy and its claim to leadership of the Muslim world, and the two countries have been engaged in a form of Cold War ever since, with Saudi Arabia supporting Saddam Hussein financially during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, and Iran backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen against a Saudi-led military coalition that has been fighting since 2015, a conflict that has created what the United Nations has described as one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. And both countries have used their enormous oil wealth and religious influence to fund and arm opposing factions in conflicts across the region, making the Iran-Saudi rivalry one of the most destabilizing forces in the Middle East and a root cause of suffering for tens of millions of people across the Arab world. The seventh deeply entrenched enmity is the rivalry between the United States and China, which has developed over recent decades from a complex relationship of economic interdependence mixed with strategic competition into what many analysts describe as the defining geopolitical rivalry of the 21st century, with the two superpowers competing for technological dominance, military supremacy, economic influence, and global political leadership across every continent. And the tensions have manifested in a devastating trade war that escalated dramatically in 2025 when President Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods, leading China to retaliate with its own counter-tariffs and export restrictions on critical minerals including gallium and germanium that are essential for semiconductor manufacturing and military electronics. And beyond trade, the two countries clash over Taiwan, which China claims as its own territory and has threatened to reunify by force if necessary. Over the South China Sea, where China has built artificial islands and military installations in disputed waters, over human rights issues in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and over China's support for Russia during the Ukraine conflict, creating a multi-front rivalry of extraordinary complexity and potential danger that, according to Pew Research Center polling in 2025, has left most Americans viewing China as either a competitor or an outright enemy of the United States. The eighth great enmity is the centuries-old rivalry between Greece and Turkey, two NATO allies who have nonetheless come to the brink of armed conflict at least 3 times in the past half-century over deeply contested issues including sovereignty over Aegean islands and airspace, the rights of Greek and Turkish communities on the island of Cyprus, which Turkey invaded and occupied in the north in 1974, and which remains divided to this day, competing claims to natural gas deposits in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, and the historical wounds left by the catastrophic Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, which followed the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and involved a massive forced population exchange that uprooted approximately 1.5 million Greeks from Turkey and 500,000 Muslims from Greece, creating collective traumas of displacement and loss that continue to fuel mutual suspicion and resentment in both societies, and Georgetown University's Journal of International Affairs has noted that Greece and Turkey are entangled in a complex set of disagreements that have brought them to the brink of war at least 3 times in the past half-century, making theirs one of the most paradoxical conflicts in the world, between two countries that are formal military allies within NATO, yet regard each other with deep mistrust and hostility. The ninth bitter enmity is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, an enclave that is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but was home to a majority ethnic Armenian population, and whose status has triggered 5 separate wars between the two countries over the past century, in 1918, in 1988 to 1994, and then again in 2016, 2020, and 2023, making it one of the most persistent and blood-soaked territorial conflicts in the former Soviet space, and the first Nagorno-Karabakh War from 1988 to 1994 alone resulted in approximately 30,000 casualties and created hundreds of thousands of refugees on both sides, while the devastating 44-day war of 2020 ended with Azerbaijan recapturing significant territory it had lost in the 1990s with the help of Turkish military support and drone technology. And then in September 2023, Azerbaijan launched a decisive military operation that resulted in the complete dissolution of the Armenian-backed government in Nagorno-Karabakh and the mass exodus of nearly the entire ethnic Armenian population from the region, an event that Armenia described as ethnic cleansing, and which has deepened the hatred between the two nations to a degree that makes genuine reconciliation extraordinarily difficult to imagine in the near future. The 10th and final great enmity on this list is the rivalry between China and Japan, two of Asia's greatest civilizations whose relationship has been scarred by some of the most brutal violence in 20th century history, most notably Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, its full-scale invasion of China in 1937, and the atrocities committed during the Nanjing Massacre of December 1937, in which Japanese troops killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians, a historical wound that China has never forgotten and which continues to poison Sino-Japanese relations to this day. And beyond the historical grievances, the two countries are engaged in an active territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands, called the Diaoyu Islands by China, a small uninhabited chain in the East China Sea that both countries claim as sovereign territory, and whose surrounding waters are believed to contain substantial oil and gas reserves. And CSIS has documented how this dispute has led to repeated confrontations between Chinese and Japanese Coast Guard vessels and military aircraft, And the rivalry between Beijing and Tokyo encompasses competition for economic influence across Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region, with Japan increasingly aligning itself with the United States and its democratic allies to counterbalance China's growing military and economic power, creating a strategic rivalry that sits at the very heart of the contest for dominance in Asia in the 21st century. And taken together, these 10 great enmities, from the US-Iran hostility to the China-Japan rivalry, represent the most dangerous, most destructive, and most deeply entrenched conflicts between nations in the world today. Conflicts fueled by history, ideology, religion, and raw national interest, and serving as a powerful reminder that while the world has made great progress in building friendships and alliances, the forces of rivalry, hatred, and conflict between nations remain among the most formidable challenges to peace, stability, and human welfare on this earth.